We all face pressure to blend in. I remember as a kid the pressure that I felt to try and get into sports. And I remember for a brief time I convinced myself that I was a baseball fan. Despite my very best efforts, I could never get into hockey. I remember how I felt pressured to dress in a certain way. How clothes that I had previously thought looked kind of dorky were suddenly cool all of a sudden, and I wanted to dress that way. I remember because I wanted to fit in that I changed the way that I cut my hair, or didn't, I guess you could say. We human beings are meant to live in communities. And being like others is sort of the price of admission, if you will, for being a part of a community. Now, in an ideal world, this isn't really a problem because communities can reinforce virtues and values. And so they could help us become the best version of ourselves. But of course, in a world where communities, like everything else, are infected with brokenness and sin, then communities can and often do exert toxic influences over us. So for example, communities in our world can often become exclusive. We tend to see people who are like us as worthwhile and deserving of dignity, and people who aren't like us, or people that we don't understand, as different and somehow not deserving respect. We do need to remember, however, that all people, even if they're immigrants, liberals, conservatives, men, women, gay, straight, all of them are made in the image of God and are therefore worthy of dignity and respect, and that to treat them in a disrespectful way is to treat the image of God within them with disrespect. Another way that community pressures can be toxic is when communities exert their power in a way to take power away from the people who already have very little of it in order to give it to those who have much, so that the whole community can serve the interests of the powerful. So communities are a big part of the problem with what's wrong with this world. But at the same time, they are central to God's solution to what ails this world. God's rescue plan, seen to begin in Israel, involves taking a community of people whose group dynamics are supposed to be different from the brokenness that we see in the world around us. It all starts when he takes an extended family of slaves out of slavery in Egypt as his special possession, a community that he can shape as a proof of concept of his wisdom to the world. He enters into covenant relationship with them. He will be their God, and they will be his people. And to this end, he gives them his instructions, the Torah, and he takes up residence among them, the tabernacle. At Sinai, God is creating a wholly new people who have a new culture based in his wisdom. The plan is that as the people move into the promised land, a land from which the original inhabitants will be driven out, they will have an opportunity to become that people as God's culture takes root in their lives. But the community is called to be different for the sake of the nations around. As those people develop into a people who exemplify who God is, the nations around will see who God is, and they too will be reconciled to God. As God said to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you, and all the nations of the world will be blessed through you. That's the idea, anyways. But in practice, it kind of goes bad. Right off the bat, the people start pagan worship. The metaphorical ink isn't dry on the covenant when the people create a golden calf and start worshiping that. When the people finally do enter into the promised land, they don't drive out the inhabitants as they were instructed, and those inhabitants become a snare for them. They become a malign influence as the Israelites are supposed to be taking on and learning this culture that God has given to them. And they become like a pack of teenagers overcome by peer pressure, and they surrender the values that they had never fully internalized, and they become just like the people around them. And just as God drove the original inhabitants out of the land on account of their sin, So God drives them out of the land on account of their sin. And the Jews end up in Babylon, and there they have to figure out what it means to be God's people while being surrounded by people who have no interest in their God. It's in this context that we read the story of 4 young men found in the book of Daniel. Over the coming weeks, we're going to look at some stories from Daniel about what it says about being God's people in the midst of a hostile culture around us. And so this morning, I want to look at the story of Daniel chapter 1. So read with me here. Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned to them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief officials presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. So Daniel and his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, didn't choose this life. It was thrust upon them, and yet they want to live faithfully to God. The story gives us an example of what it means to be set apart for God in a hostile place. From their example, we can see that even in a culture that opposes our beliefs, we are called to live distinctly for God, trusting his faithfulness and his provision. And the point of that is so that the people around us can see the wisdom of God and come to God. So we are called to be different for the sake of the world. Now, Daniel and his friends are raised in the Jewish nobility, and they're picked by the pagan king Nebuchadnezzar. Because they're given positions of importance later on, it's hard for us to realize that they are actually powerless in their situation. Their training and their teaching will be about things like divination and astrology, things that are taboo for good Jewish boys. The captors, after all, want their abilities, not their baggage as Jews. They actually want to try and sever their ties with their past culture and religious devotions. Now, despite the offensiveness of what they're being forced to learn, they're not really in a position to say no. Their situation's not much different than, say, a person who's been caught up in human trafficking and then forced to participate in acts that are opposed to their morality. But even though they're in a weak position, Daniel and his friends resolve to do whatever they can to remain faithful to God. And in their case, they find one place that they can take a stand, and that has to do with the food that they're given. Now, we're not told the specifics about what kind of provisions they're given, so we don't know exactly why they object. Some people point out that the meat served would have been offered in sacrifices to Babylon's gods. And that's probably true, but it would probably also be true of any vegetables that they were being served. Others say that the food wouldn't have adhered to Jewish dietary restrictions, which is also true, although the wine wouldn't have been a problem in that case, because Jewish dietary law doesn't prohibit people from drinking wine, except in the case where they've taken a Nazirite vow of dedication to God, but there's nothing in this text to suggest that they've done that. So the best explanation that I have seen for why Daniel and his friends refuse the meat and drink from the table is just that they want to develop a dependence on God. If they're healthy and strong while eating the king's food, it would be easy to think that they have the king to thank for their health and strength. But if they are healthy and strong despite maybe existing on somewhat meager rations, then it's clear that their health is attributable to God rather than to the king. Interestingly, the part of the text that says that they were healthier and better nourished than the other young men their age, actually the word-for-word translation in the Hebrew says they were fatter in flesh. So yes, I have the physique of a vegetarian. Even if their diet was only known to the guard who swapped food with them, I'm guessing that's probably where the vegetables came, and he got to eat their royal rations. That's probably why he agreed to do it. Even if he's the only one who knows about this swap, every time Daniel and his friends look at one more plate of steamed eggplant, they're going to remember it's God who sustains us, not this amazing food. Otherwise, being so amply supplied and being surrounded by the wisdom of another culture might have made it easy for them to forget their dependence on God. There are times when we experience circumstances that remind us of our dependence on God. So, for example, it's easy for us to look to God when things are tough. Peter Panabaker, the pastor at the Baptist church here in town, has been serving in Kirkland Lake for 20 years, long enough to see the things from the long view, the boom and bust cycle. And he once told me that when the price of gold is high and the economy booms as a result, people aren't very receptive to the message of the church. But it's actually at times when the price of gold drops and the economy suffers that suddenly people rediscover their need for God. So sometimes God ordains that we walk through difficulty because it's in that difficulty that God's sustaining power is most obvious to us. When we're aware of how dependent we are on God, it's easier for us to stay faithful to his commands, even when social pressure pushes us in the other direction. We all encounter times where we are pressured to go along with other people when they're doing things that don't honor God. Maybe it's participating in racist or sexist jokes at the water cooler at the office. Maybe it's cheating on your taxes in a way that you're pretty sure that you could get away with. When we remember that we are blessed by God's loving provision, that we owe everything that we have to him, it's easier for us to stay focused on what pleases him instead of what pleases the other people around us. And so being dependent on God is a good thing. Despite the discomfort it often creates, it keeps us focused on him. Without it, we would quickly lose sight of that dependence and might start to compromise. Now, in fact, we're always dependent on God. As Paul tells the Athenians at the Areopagus, in him we live and move and have our being. I take that to mean that if God even stopped thinking about us, we'd probably shrivel up and die. God sustains us at all times. So the question isn't whether or not we are dependent on God, it's just whether or not we are aware of our dependence. When things are going well, it's easy to forget that. When I sit down for a meal, we try to say thanks before we partake as a way of reminding ourselves that God is good to us. But when I forget to say thanks and I dig in, God doesn't suddenly make the food vanish in front of me. He's not so offended that he punishes me for that indiscretion. And so it's partly because God is so faithful to us that we can actually forget that he's there and that he's faithful. But when we're living in adversity, we don't need to be reminded of the reality. But when we live in ease, we would often profit from cultivating an awareness of our dependence on God. That's what Daniel and his friends are doing. And that's something that we should do also, at least on occasion. So, for example, we could participate in fasting. I don't think fasting's really about the fast. In the end, I think fasting is really about breaking the fast. The point isn't that I suffer and that I hurt. The point is that the suffering and the hurting reminds me of how God has blessed me. And so that when I break that fast, I have a renewed appreciation for the blessings that God has given me. Lent is a 6-week version of a fast, only, doing not necessarily all food, because we can't necessarily, subsist for 6 weeks with no food. But giving up something that's important to us so that when we once again can indulge in that thing, we appreciate that it is a good gift given to us from God. And so I should ask myself, in my daily life, are there places where I'm reminded of my dependence on God? I remember one instance when I was going to school in Costa Rica. This is going back about 25 years ago, where there wasn't like tap payments. There were no smartphones, so you couldn't just do that either. And I lived at a YWAM base where my basic needs, like I had a place to stay and they fed me 3 meals a day and everything. But if I was out on the town and I wanted to pick up a snack or a treat for myself, I have to pay for it with cash. And I remember once I ran out of cash and I felt like the Spirit told me not to go to the ATM and get more. And this was kind of hard for me because, I like to have the freedom of knowing that if I want something, I could just go and buy it. But I remember when that happened, how when somebody would give me something, that it would feel like, you know what? I see that God has seen my needs and he's provided. And so this little thing that would have been something I would have bought without thinking twice about it is now a gift that comes to me from God. And I was reminded of his faithfulness. If we don't experience our dependence on God, it can be a blessing to cultivate a discipline of dependence. That might be saying that I'm going to choose to give in a way that is painful, that goes beyond my comfort zone, either giving more of my time or more of my money than I would otherwise choose to do. Or it might mean stepping out into a place of obedience for which I feel inadequate. Okay, God, you say you want me to do that. I don't think I really have the skill set, but I guess if you're calling me to do that and I step out, then it's a way that you can show me how you're faithful. When I depend on God, I learn to trust in his faithfulness. And only when we trust in God's faithfulness will we be able to live in a distinctively Christian way. So just as Daniel and his friends maintain a distinctive identity while surrounded by a hostile culture, Christians are called to live in a countercultural way. God's law, which is of course clarified by Jesus, directs the community to embody a strange, unusual set of attributes. The Christian community should be devoted to God. It should advocate for the powerless. It should be committed to peace and reconciliation and faithful to one another. It's not enough for the church to be distinctive. The way in which we are distinctive is what matters. When the church becomes a distinctive body without embodying this new set of God-given values, our countercultural example is confused. Our differentness can be meaningless or sometimes even counterproductive. It's not all that uncommon for us to see people who wear the badges of Christianity, talk like Christians, tell people that they're Christians, while they embody values that aren't in step with Jesus. I remember one uncomfortable bus ride when I was a missionary in Budapest. I was crammed into a very tight bus, and as I was sitting in my seat, there beside me was a young couple who were making out in a very passionate and physical manner right in front of me, and the girl was wearing a WWJD bracelet. And I remember looking up and thinking, I don't think that's how Jesus would do that. Or maybe you get cut off in traffic by a person with a Jesus fish on the back of their car. Or maybe there's a person who loves to tell everybody that they're a Christian, and at the same time, their attitude and the things that they say about immigrants suggest that they don't think that they're really worthy of human dignity. The distinctiveness of God's people is meant to draw people into God rather than to put them off. As Jesus tells us, you're the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden, and neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. For Daniel and his friends, this strange diet was distinctive, but it was their distinct God-given wisdom that set them apart from everybody else. Because they rely on God, they were given greater wisdom than their peers. It says in the text that they were 10 times better than the other magicians and enchanters. Their wisdom reveals God's power. In the story that follows, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He's actually going to put to death all of the wise men if they can't not just tell him the meaning of the dream, but also tell him the dream itself. And when Daniel hears about it, he prays, and God gives him the wisdom to know what the dream was and know what it means for the sake of all of those wise men who would be put to death, but also to demonstrate to Nebuchadnezzar that God is the true source of wisdom. And so Daniel's wisdom is given to him for the benefit of the nations. Our distinctiveness is likewise meant to show God's wisdom to the world. We must ask ourselves, though, does the world see something attractive in the way that Christians are different? I remember early on in the pandemic, waking up one night at 3:30 in the morning to the ring of my doorbell, which is something that probably most people fear, because if somebody's ringing your doorbell at 3:30, it's probably some sort of terrible emergency. When I went to answer the door, there was a man I've never seen before in my life, or never seen since, standing on my door. And the man asked if he could come in. Of course I'll let you into my house, perfect stranger, at 3:30 in the morning while my wife and kids are sleeping at the back of the house. I was a little nervous about it. But he came in and sat down and told me that my neighbor across the street had told him I'm a pastor. Thanks. And then he began to tell me about his experience of loneliness and emotional difficulties. Now, important note, if you need pastoral care and it's not a dire emergency, I'd appreciate it if you didn't show up on my front porch during the wee hours. But at the same time, I was struck by how this man came to a complete stranger in his time of need because he knew that I was a Christian. He came to me because he expected that a Christian would be more willing to help him than somebody who wasn't. And I find that encouraging. Those outside the church will have disagreements with us. Of course they will, or they would be part of us. Yet despite those differences, to those who are honest with themselves, see in us uncommon mercy, generosity, kindness, safety, or insight. If we embody God's wisdom, they should. This is how we are meant to be different for God's glory. So God has brought a people, the church, into existence so that we can showcase his wisdom. As God's people in a pluralistic society, being his people means depending on God, maintaining a distinctive way that demonstrates his wisdom. We can see this in the life of Daniel and his friends, who make the choice to live faithfully as servants of God, even seeking the good of the country where they are being held as captives. As Christians in a pluralistic society, we share some of the same struggles with the Jewish exiles to Babylon. Like Daniel and his friends, God wants us to be different for the sake of other people around us. So we need to be willing to stand apart from our culture, not as a rejection of the people in that culture, but so that God's power can work through us to bless them. If we live in this way, many will see God's love and wisdom, and some will come to be reconciled to him. So let's remember to be distinct, but also the reason for our being distinct, that God has sent us into the world for their sake.